Imagine you are in the dark and feel no ground under your feet. You feel lost. But then something comes into your life that speaks with a very clear voice. But the darkness keeps on dominating. A process starts. You feel your perspective changing. No problems are solved. But the despair slowly disappears. An understanding emerges how things work. So, you start addressing these things. Light comes in again. Nothing solved, but everything changed. Psychoanalysis came into my life. Books of TODD McGOWAN, Associate Professor of Film Studies at the University of Vermont, were the main guides. In it, insights based on work of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan. The foundation of psychoanalysis is the unconscious. Psychoanalysis emerges with the discovery of the disturbance that unconscious thoughts cause in the daily life of neurotic subjects and how it shapes the dreams of even non-neurotic subjects. But this is instantly a problem because the existence of the unconscious portends the absence of any possible foundation for knowledge. Despite Freud's hope that psychoanalysis would attain the status of a science, the impossibility of realizing this hope lies within the heart of the psychoanalytic project itself. Psychoanalysis reveals that knowledge is never simply knowledge, but that desire always accompanies it. That desire always trumps knowledge when it comes to how we act. The unconscious is this desire from which knowledge can never extricate itself.
Zie je die lichtpunten erachter? De horizon zijn boten.
The unconscious is not simply what is not conscious. If it were, then it would not cause the disturbance to psychic equilibrium that it causes. The unconscious is rather radically distinct from consciousness and functions in a completely different way. One can consciously pursue one's self-interest with ease, but desire does not fit so neatly into consciousness. The problem is that the subject's desire is opposed to and undermines the subject's self-interest. Desire has a traumatic charge, because the subject desires against its own good. And this is one of the fundamental discoveries of psychoanalysis, a discovery that places psychoanalysis in opposition to almost the entire history of philosophy and to common sense, which sees our good, or happiness, as the unquestioned aim of all our actions. The unconscious doesn't just exist apart from consciousness, but acts as an existential threat to consciousness. It is as if an alien were residing within the psyche of the subject, which is why the subject has no direct access to it and must resort to dreams, slips, jokes, works of art, or the psychoanalytic session in order to access it. The basis of psychoanalysis is the discovery of the unconscious. The German idealist Friedrich Schelling was the first to use the term unconscious to describe the functioning of the mind, and several romantic poets and philosophers, like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, picked up on this concept. But the unconscious of Romanticism is not the unconscious that Freud discovers. The romantic unconscious is an inner self formed by emotions and feelings, and this unconscious doesn't appear externally. For Freud, the unconscious doesn't defy articulation, but manifests itself through speech and other acts. In psychoanalysis, the unconscious is not a site of emotions and feelings. It instead houses a logic incompatible with the conscious mind, a logic oriented around desire. Freud takes an interest in dreams because they unlock the unconscious, and films which share the structure of dreams carry the same promise. Desire realizes itself when it obtains the object that it seeks. But desire satisfies itself through its failure to realize itself and obtain the object. In this sense, the obstacle that desire confronts is more important and more satisfying than the object of desire. The object of desire always disappoints the subject, but the obstacle to this object provides a constant source of satisfaction. We enjoy the barrier, which is why the most satisfying relationships are also the most troubling. The dream reveals that satisfaction and failure are inseparable. When we dream the fulfillment of a wish, we do so by dreaming the distortion of the wish in order to sustain the desire as a desire. Desire is traumatic because its satisfaction doesn't coincide with its realization, with obtaining the object. And the dream and the film make evident this disjunction through their investment in the obstacle as the source of satisfaction for the dreamer and the spectator. This type of revelation does not occur in everyday life, and we need the dream or the film in order to experience it. Our everyday waking life resists the recognition of the disjunction between the satisfaction and the realization of desire. Consciousness plays a substantial role in everyday life, and its apparatus cannot accommodate the equation of satisfaction and failure. Consciousness views satisfaction in terms of success, scoring the winning goal, obtaining the new romantic partner, winning the lottery. But this image of success is antithetical to the way in which the unconscious satisfies itself. The unconscious is not simply what is not conscious, but a completely different structure of relating to the world. There is a radical discontinuity between consciousness and the unconscious. We can think of the opposition between consciousness and the unconscious in terms of the contrast between will and desire. The subject wills something actively through a conscious choice. One targets a goal through an act of will and then tries to achieve the goal. Unlike will, desire is always unconscious and irreducible to conscious manipulation. The unconscious status of desire renders it difficult to know. One cannot gain access to one's desire by engaging in sustained and deep reflection on it. In this sense, psychoanalysis opposes itself to the history of philosophical introspection. The unconscious is not merely what escapes the awareness of conscious thoughts. It is instead what the subject cannot bring to consciousness, what is antithetical to conscious knowledge. But there are ways to access the unconscious. It appears when consciousness is not ready for it. We cannot know the unconscious, but we can encounter when it takes us by surprise and jolts us into a new awareness.
Death drive is, for Freud, the way in which we don't act for our own pleasure or our own good, the way that our actions are undermining ourselves and undermining others. Or you might say that the death drive is destruction for the sake of destruction, that there's no ulterior motive, we're not gaining anything because of it, and yet we're totally invested in it. Here's a nice little example of it from a film by Orson Welles called Mr. Arcadin.
Now I'm going to tell you about a scorpion. This scorpion wanted to cross a river. So he asked the frog to carry him. No, said the frog, no, thank you. If I let you on my back, you may sting me, and the sting of a scorpion is death. Now, whereas the scorpion is the logic of that, for scorpions always try to be logical. If I sting you, you will die. I will drown. So the frog was convinced and allowed the scorpion on his back, but just in the middle of the river, he felt a terrible pain and realized that after all, the scorpion had stung him. Logic, cried the dying frog as he started underbearing the scorpion down with him. There is no logic in this. I know, said the scorpion, but I can't help it. It's my character. Let's drink to character.
What Wells describes here as character is death drive. That is, this destructiveness that overcomes us, even when it's going to mean our own destruction. Freud articulates his idea of death drive in the great revolutionary book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, published in 1920. So this book really cuts psychoanalysis directly in half. There's the idea of psychoanalysis before and the idea after, and it's death drive that really informs this change. What's interesting is that many psychoanalysts around Freud who were indebted to the early Freud broke from him over this idea of death drive or didn't follow him down the path of death drive. What overcomes Freud when he sets out to write Beyond the Pleasure Principle is the insistence on returning to or reliving unpleasant or traumatic experiences. He sees this first at the beginning of Beyond the Pleasure Principle in war neuroses. And then he looks at other examples of this same phenomena, ending with what he calls the negative therapeutic reaction. That is, people who get to the end of their psychoanalysis when they would be cured and better, and then they regress and undermine their own progress. And this is something he finds inexplicable and something that he has to search for an explanation for. And the search is beyond the pleasure principle. So the pleasure principle, just to review, is a very paradoxical concept because it doesn't mean getting excited about something for Freud. In fact, it means the opposite. It means the elimination of excitation. So that idea is already an interesting and paradoxical one, that pleasure is the elimination of excitation, not the building up of it. And for Freud, the compulsion to repeat is a problem because it contrasts with the idea of getting rid of excitation, that the compulsion to repeat builds up excitation, whereas, according to the pleasure principle and Freud's understanding of the psyche up to this time, we should be trying to get rid of all excitation. So the contrast between the two is that the pleasure principle is about the elimination of excitation, as I said earlier, and the death drive, we can think, is about sustaining excitation. So this, if you think about it in this way, you cease to get this association with returning to inorganic life or dying, and instead, death drive means a way of giving yourself trouble in order to sustain your level of excitation. So pleasure principle would be eliminating trouble, and death drive is giving yourself more trouble. Very end of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud makes a pretty remarkable statement. He says the pleasure principle actually seems to be in service of the death drive. So he clearly creates a hierarchy in his thought that goes against his earlier hierarchy, which had pleasure principle in the top position. Now it's clearly death drive that's on top, and pleasure principle serves it, which means it eliminates excitation only for death drive to then repeat and create more excitation. So the function of pleasure principle just is giving death drive something to do, you might say. That's Jacques Lacan. For Lacan, the idea of death drive is present even in his earliest seminars. But it's really in Seminar 7, which is called The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, that he fleshes out the idea of what he means by it. And he sees death drive as a movement beyond the symbolic order. So death drive is a way that the subject has of reaching out beyond everything that's given in their symbolic world. Here's how he puts it. The drive of destruction calls into question all that exists, but it is equally a will to creation starting from nothing, a will to begin again. One of his chapters in Seminar 7, or one of the sessions in Seminar 7, is on creation ex nihilo. Another section is on death drive. And it's about this starting from nothing. And he thinks death drive is crucial to this desire we have to restart, that desire to restart everything from zero is actually death drive at work. That death drive leads to what Lacan sees as a symbolic death, and that evacuates the entire symbolic field for the subject. So the subject's own symbolic suicide through death drive is a way of starting over everything. So at any point in one's existence, one can start over and make everything that counted, everything that was valuable for you as a subject, count that for nothing, and then start again in an entirely new way. And that's for Lacan what's death drive in Seminar 7.
When Freud wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, he conceives of what he calls the death drive for the first time. The death drive is a structure that controls the subject beyond the pleasure principle. It overrules the power of the pleasure principle and leads the subject to seek suffering rather than pleasure. At the same time, this turn in Freud's thought makes theoretical space for what Jacques Lacan would later term jouissance or enjoyment. One can only think about the possibility of enjoyment if the pleasure principle does not have the last word, and this dethroning of the pleasure principle occurs in Freud's 1920 work. As much as the discovery of the unconscious at the beginning of psychoanalysis, it represents a decisive moment for psychoanalytic theory. The difference between pleasure and enjoyment lies in the inherent excessiveness of the latter. The term excessive enjoyment is a redundancy because enjoyment is by definition excessive. When one enjoys, one necessarily enjoys too much. Enjoyment is too much pleasure, and as such, it always involves suffering. Subjects necessarily suffer their enjoyment. Pleasure does not disturb us, but enjoyment derails our subjectivity at the same time as it gives the subject a reason to keep going. Enjoyment disturbs our happiness and deprives us of pleasure, but we pursue it nonetheless. It is what goes against our own good and against our self-interest. We derive enjoyment from sacrificing our self-interest rather than pursuing it.
Pleasure is, in a way, pleasure and enjoyment are opposed. In Lacan's way of thinking, in my way of thinking, I think in Freud's way of thinking, although it's not as clear, Freud wouldn't use these terms. He does use the term pleasure. He doesn't use the term enjoyment. For him would be Genuss or something like that, but he doesn't really use that often. But yeah, so pleasure is and Freud's definition of pleasure is even a little counterintuitive, but I think it's right. So pleasure is for Freud the getting rid of an excess excitation. So right, so I'm like I feel stimulated in some way, right? Like I feel hunger, and then I eat a big piece of cake, and I feel I no longer have that stimulation, that excitation of hunger, right? So that would be then there's the pleasure of eating it, and then the pleasure ends when the excitation
is gone. Enjoyment's the opposite. So enjoyment is the actual excitation or accept the way we're bothered, right? So enjoyment would be precisely this feeling of, oh, I'm craving a big piece of cake, and I don't have like that for Lacan. For me, if I think for Freud, in a sense, that's what enjoyment means. So it's more the one way to think about it. It's the trouble we give ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's the trouble that we give ourselves that we could get out of, right? So we can. So I for instance, like I think this is a stupid example. So I decide I'm going to be fit, right? So I'm going to lift weights and it's not enjoyable, right? Like, or not pleasurable, I should say. It's enjoyable, right? Like it's not, it's painful. It's struggle, but that's enjoyment, right? Like that, like I didn't need to, I could have just sat in my chair or done aerobic exercise, kept it that way. But instead I do this thing that causes me trouble. And I have to exert myself and do this thing that's unpleasurable. But that's what enjoyment is, this too much trouble that we give ourselves.
As opposed to pleasure, enjoyment depends on its opposition to the good and to self-interest. That is to say, we enjoy wasteful and useless activities. The enjoyment attached to drunkenness is not simply the absence of restraint that it allows, but also the freedom from utility that it authorizes. When drunk, I can act uselessly, and I almost inevitably do. But the inutility of enjoyment is not purely pleasurable. Enjoyment is always traumatic enjoyment. Though we don't enjoy every trauma, we never enjoy without trauma.
In Seminar 11, Lacan adjusts his idea of death drive pretty significantly. So it's a concept that is malleable through both Freud's career and through Lacan's career. So let's look at that. He comes to think that drive follows a circular movement. So Seminar 11 is a description of different drives, but what's interesting is the different drives all follow the path of death drive. So death drive provides the pattern for drive. For Lacan, this death drive is the way that the subject inherently satisfies itself. So there's something about death drive that's not necessarily pleasurable, but is necessarily satisfying. So this equation of death drive with satisfaction, which is kind of there in Freud, becomes really explicit in Lacan in Seminar 11. And drive satisfies itself. This is what's interesting. by missing its object, not by getting it. So this is a real revolutionary idea by Lacan that goes a little bit further than anywhere that Freud went with the concept of death drive. That drive is a satisfaction obtained by not getting something, a satisfaction obtained by not obtaining, one might say. So his idea is that psychoanalysis, it can't give the subject the drive, it can't take away the subject's drive. All it can do is shorten the circuit of the subject's drive. So the subject comes into analysis taking too much trouble for their satisfaction, and psychoanalysis just lessens the trouble, shortens the circuit. So it's interesting that there's a series of books called the Short Circuit series, directed by Slavoj Žižek, which I think is a little homage to this idea that what psychoanalysis does is shorten the circuit. That's Lacan's idea. Here's how he puts it. For their satisfaction, they give themselves too much trouble. Up to a point, it is this too much trouble that is the sole justification of our intervention. So shortening the circuit of the drive, eliminating the too much trouble, allowing the drive to go smoother, is the justification for psychoanalysis.
The desiring subject emerges through its entrance into the social order, its submission to the demands of a symbolic law, a process that constitutes the subject through lack. As a being becomes subject through its entrance into language, need transforms into desire. Unlike need, which can be directly satisfied through obtaining its object, desire orients itself around the other and what the other wants. This renders desire much more complicated than need and impossible to satisfy with a mere object. The desiring subject seeks the key to its lack in the field of the other. Its desire is the desire of the other. But the path of desire is infinite, because the subject's desire can never align up perfectly with what the other offers the subject. In the visual field, for instance, the subject desires to see precisely what is not visible in the other, and what results is that the subject continually seeks without ever finding. Visually, desire concerns what we don't see, not what we see. Even George Clooney becomes just an ordinary guy if one actually has a relationship with him. We cannot satisfy ourselves through having, because having is precisely what destroys the desirability of the object. In this sense, self-sabotage represents a desperate attempt to sustain desire. Manufacturing ways of not having the object keeps us desiring it. One of the ways that we do this is to place objects off limits and make them sacred. We date the wrong kind of person for us, we overeat so that we'll feel bad and be able to desire having a good body. We overschedule our time so that we don't have the freedom that we desire. We drink too much so that we can desire feeling better or having more control. In each case, the obstacle to desire is more desirable for us than the supposed object that lies beyond this obstacle. In order to make sense of this strange phenomenon, Jacques Lacan distinguishes between two types of object to which our desire relates. There is, for Lacan, an object of desire, which is the object through which the subject tries to realize its desire. This is what desire seeks. But there is also the lost object that causes the subject to desire, an object that Lacan christens the objet petit a or objet A. It indicates the point of absence that arouses our desire, because we associate it with a lost enjoyment that we are incapable of finding present anywhere in the world. No empirical object provides this enjoyment, but the objet A suggests its possibility to us. The objet A is the lost object, but Lacan coins the term objet A rather than calling it the lost object. That's the term that Freud employs, because he wants to avoid the suggestion that this object ever existed. The objet A becomes the cause of the subject's desire, not because it once provided satisfaction for the subject, but because it marks the loss that the subject experiences when it begins to speak. It is what the subject sacrifices of itself, but it has no substantial existence prior to its sacrifice, which is why the term lost object is somewhat of a misnomer. The objet A has such a crucial position because it enables us to think about the subject's relation to its world in terms of a lack that doesn't lack something substantial. It is not a present object that arouses our desire, but what is missing in the field of experience. As such, the objet A is not the object of desire, but the object that causes the subject to desire. We can think about the distinction between the object of desire and the object A in another way, by considering our desire in relation to an ordinary object, like a can of Coke or a can of beer. When we approach a can of Coke, the Coke itself functions as the object of desire. We want to drink the soda and have no desire for the can that contains it. And yet, if there were a boundless supply of Coke in the world, we would have no desire for it. The cause of our desire for the Coke, the objet A in the case of the Coke, is the can that limits how much we can have. The object A, or object that causes our desire, is not the object that we desire, but the obstacle to that object.
Das Fehlen der Liebe, wissen Sie? Es ist ein solcher Schmerz.
Die Rettung kommt nur aus uns selbst. Und seien Sie sicher, ich schrecke nicht davor zurück, selbst das Unwahrscheinlichste zu denken. Gute Nacht.
I just want to add one final attempt at defining death drive and trying to understand its logic in one final different way. So I see drive as what produces enjoyment or satisfaction through loss. Now that's in keeping, I think, with both Freud and Lacan and even with Zizek. And I also believe that drive must necessarily be unconscious, that in some way drive is the logic of the unconscious, that the unconscious obeys a logic of satisfaction through sacrifice and loss that cannot be made conscious. That the reason why the unconscious is unconscious and not just not conscious is because it obeys this different logic that focuses on loss and finds satisfaction in sacrifice and loss. Whereas consciously, we find pleasure in obtaining. So the conscious will is driven by the logic of power, and the unconscious desire is driven, or the unconscious drive is driven by the logic of loss and sacrifice. But why loss? I think it's an interesting question. Like, why would loss be satisfying? It seems like we can see instances of it. We can see the way in which people constantly engage in self-destructive behavior, the way humans fight wars, the way we unleash loss on ourselves and other people all the time. But why do we do it? It seems stupid. It doesn't seem to make any sense, and it seems like a very weird explanation for human behavior. But if you think about it in terms of the way in which we desire, I think it makes a little bit more sense that if we lose or sacrifice something, we create then an object that is valuable. We give an object some kind of transcendent or sublime value in the act of losing or sacrificing it. The link, of course, between sacrifice and the sacred is evident in the terms and in the rituals. But I think the same thing is true for all forms of loss, that loss gives us something to desire because it gives us something valuable, that it creates a value that doesn't just exist. So the idea would be there are no values that just are. That value has to come into existence in some way. How does it come into existence? Through the act of sacrifice or loss. There are no objects just lying around waiting to be desired. We have to sacrifice them into existence. And that's what we're doing all the time. All of our self-destructive behavior is a way of creating our own ability to keep desiring, which is the idea of death drive. So through loss, we produce and then experience the enjoyable object. And that's why loss has such a fundamental role in our psyche. That's why we fight wars. That's why we kill ourselves. That's why we do anything. I mean, killing yourself probably is the worst example of it, because then loss goes too far, that you lose the ability to even enjoy loss. But every kind of self-destructive act, repeating the same kind of romance with a new object, gaining too much weight, exercising too much until you become unhealthily sick. All these things are an example of the way in which loss becomes enjoyable and produces something enjoyable. The idea is that objects only have their worth through sacrifice and loss, that objects themselves are not valuable, that we have to lose them or sacrifice them in order to create their value. I would even say that we can only enjoy what we are willing to or have sacrificed. So enjoyment and sacrifice are absolutely linked to each other, which is why we engage in so many sacrificial rituals. Not the least of them is religion, but there are many others where we sacrifice all the time in order to enjoy. I think sports teams are one of the greatest examples of this, where players sacrifice their bodies and fans sacrifice enormous amounts of time and psychic energy, all for nothing, for a game that's meaningless. But it becomes incredibly meaningful because so much sacrifice is given to it and creates the enjoyment that's possible in the sporting activity. But it's impossible to say, I'm going to consciously take up the death drive. Because the death drive follows a logic, as I've said, of the unconscious that cannot be made conscious. So I think the most that we can do is reconcile ourselves to the death drive. Or you might say, make a conscious allowance for the unconscious and its disruption of our lives. So when it occurs, see it, recognize it, and accept it, rather than constantly trying to avoid our own death drive. Because I think it's in the attempt to avoid our own death drive that leads to displacing it on others and aggression. There is a possibility, I think, in the opposite direction, for a link between the death drive and ethics, between this absolute loss, this giving up of one's self, this sacrifice of everything about one's symbolic identity. The ability to do this, the ability to accept an absolute loss, is what makes us ethical beings. This absolute self-destructiveness of death drive can actually be a way to think about the Kantian moral law, can actually connect to the Kantian moral law, which enjoins us to act without regard for the self. So there's a real link, I think, between death drive, which undermines self-interest, and the Kantian moral law, which tells us to act without self-interest. But I think it's really the key to understanding both ideas, both death drive and Kantian moral law, that there's a real ethical component to death drive that, if we don't explore, ends up manifesting itself in the opposite direction as incredible aggressive violence. Death drive as the possibility of ethics, but also the possibility of the worst that happens when we don't take the ethical path.
I want all my garmentos.
Is this a dream? Making this clip marks for me the transition I had gotten into. None of my problems were solved, but I managed to change the way I relate to my problems. This is the house I grew up in. The first 12 years of my life here were a disaster, because this place was the battlefield of a war that was going on between my parents all the time. They really fought like cat and dog with each other. When my dad was at work, so not at home, there was always a Cold War tension present, because of course he could return every moment. This was in the 60s of last century. That small round window there was my first own room in the house. In it I used to listen to the hits of the Beatles all the time, or even accompany the music on the cymbal and snare drum I had, with the other windows over there wide open. The Beatles were for me the proof that another reality, one with beauty and excitement in it, was possible. That's why I have warm feelings when I'm standing here near this house, although it was mainly a battlefield with a war situation, and I couldn't escape that. I understand now that that misery made me desire to be a Beatle or something like that. Because the Beatles and their music represented freedom, or as I would say now, enjoyment or jouissance for me at that time. This brings me to the topic of sacred ground. Sacred ground for me is a physical place that has desire attached to it. Here I am in Wimpole Street in London. While I, as a young kid, was desiring a world without the aggression I lived in daily, the Beatles gave me a taste of such a peaceful universe, at least the possibility of it. This is the house where Paul McCartney lived from 1963 to 1966. The parents of his girlfriend and fiancée Jane Asher were so kind to accommodate a steady place for him while the Beatles were becoming the larger-than-life act they are until today, which is more than 50 years after their breakup. John Lennon often visited Paul here, and several of their first hits of the Beatles, like I Wanna Hold Your Hand and Yesterday, were written in this place. This is the house Paul McCartney bought for himself in 1966 in Cavendish Avenue in St. John's Wood. It is still the place he stays in when he is in London. The legend goes that when Paul wrote Blackbird for the double white album of the Beatles, he, as a gesture to the small group of fans who used to hang around here, premiered it in one of the rooms up there. I am here with my son Misha, but we were here before in August 2011, and then I also filmed our walk from here to the Abbey Road studios. That is about a 5-minute walk or so. And here are the legendary studios of Abbey Road. So, Wimpole Street, Cavendish Avenue and Abbey Road is sacred ground for me. This here is sacred ground for my son Misha, the Emirates Stadium, home of his favorite soccer team, Arsenal.
The away chain. The away chain.
Yes. That's the ice block that you're talking about. Gabriel Jesús.
Sieht man.
Oh, look at that.
Senta, cerca. Anda.
The fact that it is sacred ground for Misha is most evidently proved when he recalls several important moments of matches he saw on TV or internet of Arsenal.
Ik weet nog de goal van Persie in 2011 tegen Barcelona vanuit die hoek tegen Valdes. De comeback van Thierry Henry 2013. Ook een goal daar in de FA Cup. Ja, noem ze maar op, hè. De 5-2 tegen Tottenham van Persie kapte daarin uit, schiet hem in de verre hoek. Dat is volgens mij ook 2013.
The Beatles created not only the desire for another world than the one I was living in when they were in existence, they also made music one of the, if not the most important thing in my life. Much later, this love for music brought me to all kinds of other music, like the contemporary composed music of Bas Andriessen. Unfortunately, he died in 2021. This year, 2023, the house where Louis had composed 19% of his very large oeuvre was returned to the owner. It was rented from for, well, more than 4 decades. Me was given permission to film it very shortly before returning the keys. So this spot in Amsterdam, which I visited several times to interview Louis, is without any doubt sacred ground, especially of course the room where he did his composing. This is the place where Vincent van Gogh, more or less one of the main godfathers of modern painting, was born in March 1853. There's not much to see here, but this also is of course sacred ground. Very special is the little cemetery near the church where Vincent's father was a priest for some time, because there is a grave of an older brother of Vincent who died as an infant, and he was called Vincent too. So I'm wondering what kind of thoughts and feelings must Vincent have had when he stood here on this spot watching the tomb of his brother with his own name on it. Rather confusing, maybe disturbing.
Well, I think aesthetics is actually the one place where Death Drive does allow a benefit that still is true to Death Drive, right? Like I think because it's not a benefit that comes after, it's a benefit of the very process itself, and so it's not this like reward, right? Like it's just the beauty of the process itself, and I think that's really. I mean, I'm tempted to say that's what art is, right? Like art is this like the beauty of a certain kind of like turning one's self-destruction into a form of beauty while it remains a kind of self-destruction and doesn't escape that. So I think that for me is a benefit that's not some kind of reward, but it's just a benefit of the process.
Freud's great revolution in the history of thought stems from his conception of the subject as a subject of desire, rather than as a subject of knowledge. Where thinkers from Plato to Kant consider an inherent striving to know as essential to subjectivity, not only does Freud envision a different essential drive, he contends that the subject wants not to know in order to continue to desire. The subject acts not on the basis of what it knows, but on the basis of how it desires. We might imagine linking these two ideas of the subject if you could link the act of knowledge and the act of desiring. But knowledge and desire are at odds. The subject doesn't want to know what it desires or how it enjoys. Its knowledge remains necessarily incomplete, and the gap within knowledge is the trigger for the subject's desire and the point at which it enjoys. The unconscious emerges out of the subject's incapacity for knowing its own enjoyment. Conscious knowledge is not simply unable to arrive at the knowledge of enjoyment and its traumatic origin. It actively functions as a barrier to this knowledge. Conscious knowledge thwarts access to the unconscious, and as a result, the conscious effort to know continually defeats itself. Psychoanalysis attempts to fill this fundamental lacuna in the project of knowledge by demanding that the subject abandon the project in its traditional manifestation. It constructs a space that brackets conscious knowledge in order that the subject might discover the unconscious. The fundamental rule of psychoanalysis: one must reveal not what one knows, but the words that come to mind, aims at bringing to light what the subject doesn't want to know. a gap exists between what the subject knows and what it says. In the act of speaking, the subject says more than it consciously knows, and this excess is the unconscious, a knowledge that the subject has without knowing it. The paradox of this knowledge is that one can access it only when not seeking it, and that once one has it, one has lost it. Adherence to the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, insofar as it is possible, allows subjects to recognize what they don't know when it surprises them. But it doesn't thereby permit subjects to make progress through the acquisition of knowledge. The recognitions that one makes in psychoanalysis do not have the status of knowledge in the traditional sense of the term. Instead, they mark an irreducible gap in the field of knowledge. One recognizes oneself in an unconscious desire that remains foreign, and one takes responsibility for it despite its foreignness. By doing so, one does not change or progress as a subject, but becomes what one already was. One sees the death drive as the truth of one's subjectivity rather than as an obstacle that one might try to progress beyond in order to reach the good.
I think you could argue that artists are the real, I don't know what, champions of death drive, right? Like the real artist, I think, is like they don't, because like the recompense that comes after that's meaningless to the artist, right? It's the actual art act of producing the work of art, which is useless, meaningless. It doesn't the very thing that it's only art because it doesn't serve some social role. You can turn whatever you're doing in, you can treat it like art in that way, right? Like you can do it not for whatever kind of recompense you get, but just for the actual destructive, self-destructive activity itself, I think. when I was much younger, I was totally invested in Heidegger and the notion of being towards death, and Kierkegaard still is really important for me. And I think that, so I do think that angst, I think that I would want to, I mean, obviously the problem with existentialism is the way it doesn't conceive of unconscious and, or a death drive really, obviously. So, but I guess what I like about, I think that all those affects that are associated, like despair in Kierkegaard, angst in Heidegger, like I think that those affects are really attempts to think about the phenomenon of death drive without ever naming it. So I think that there's a way in which the whole existentialist project could be rethought in terms of unconscious death drive and how the like the things that existentialism, the kind of ways it conceives of freedom are a little misguided because it hasn't yet incorporated death drive into that sense of what makes us free, right? So that's, I think for me, the real thing, like the affects, I think work out fine. It's the project of freedom, like Sartre's notion of freedom. I think, it depends for him. It depends on this pre-reflective cogito that's consciousness, right? And so I think that is to see that it's actually our unconscious death drive that is the source of our freedom. That seems like a radically different, a way to kind of radically update the existentialist project. And I think I really believe that, it's the only in the way we subvert ourselves that we can ever be free. You can't consciously intend to be self-destructive because then that destruction becomes something positive, and then that's not death drive. So I think I like that idea that it doesn't lie, that it's like what's revealed after the lies are exposed, right?
Freud discovered that subjects find satisfaction in their suffering. If therapy threatens to relieve this suffering, patients often respond by finding ways to make themselves worse again. Freud doesn't dismiss this behavior as a function of neurosis, but sees in it a verdict on the subject as such. It manifests itself most clearly in the inability of any subject to live out a harmonious existence. Freud concludes that the satisfaction of subjects depends on a disturbance to their psychic equilibrium, on the absence of what they desire rather than its presence. The presence of an object reveals its inadequacy, while its absence allows the subject to find it satisfying. This creates a world in which subjects subvert their own happiness in order to sustain their satisfaction. Freud himself has difficulty formulating the implications of the new theory of subjectivity and integrating it into his existing theory. And yet, it represents the most radical moment of Freud's thought, because it enables us to understand why subjects so often fail to act in ways that would obviously benefit them. According to psychoanalytic thinking, neither the subject nor the social order exists independently, but instead emerges out of the other's incompleteness. The subject exists at the point of the social order's failure to become a closed structure, and the subject enters into social arrangements as a result of its own failure to achieve self-identity. The internal contradictions within every social order create the space for the subject, just as the internal contradictions of the subject produce an opening to externality that links the subject to the social order. Failure on each side provides the connective apparatus and constitutes the bond between the subject and the social order. To put it another way, the subject's entrance into a group or society depends on the originary loss that gives birth to its subjectivity. Without this loss and the desire that it produces in the subject, no one would agree to enter into a social bond, a bond that places a fundamental restriction on the subject's ability to enjoy. The idea of a foundational loss is nonetheless essential for theorizing the emergence of subjectivity. Without loss, there could be no desire and no subjectivity. This loss leads the subject to society as the site where loss might be redeemed. Critique of capitalism begins with its injustice and moves to its repressiveness. But the decisive problem with capitalism is not the injustice that it produces or its repressiveness. It is our inability within the capitalist dynamic to recognize how we obtain satisfaction. As long as we remain capitalist subjects, we see ourselves as dissatisfied beings pursuing a future satisfaction. This satisfaction is embodied in the promise of the commodity. In the second volume of Capital, Karl Marx makes a statement that summarizes capitalism and the possibility of undermining it. It is a statement worthy of Freud after 1920. And yet he made it roughly 50 years in advance of Freud, writing beyond the pleasure principle. Marx says, quote, "For capitalism is already essentially abolished once we assume that it is enjoyment that is the driving motive and not enrichment itself." End of quote. Here, Marx understands that capitalism depends on a psychic investment in the promise of the future, and that a sense of one's satisfaction is incompatible with the continued survival of capitalism. This is the most profound statement and his most important legacy. Until we accept that the satisfaction of loss is our driving motive, we will remain the hostages of an economy of enrichment.
Yeah. Come back like 50 years later and they're still there. This is what happened to the child land there.
A society founded on a recognition of the death drive would be one that viewed its limitations as the source of its infinite enjoyment, rather than an obstacle to that enjoyment. To take the clearest and most traumatic example in recent history, the recognition of the death drive in 1930s Germany would have conceived the figure of the Jew not as the barrier to the ultimate enjoyment that must therefore be eliminated, but as the internal limit through which German society attained its enjoyment. As numerous theorists have said, the appeal of Nazism lay in its ability to mobilize the enjoyment of the average German through pointing out a threat to that enjoyment. The average German under Nazism could enjoy the figure of the Jew as it appeared in the form of an obstacle. But it is possible to recognize the obstacle not as an external limit, but as an internal one. In this way, the figure of the Jew would become merely a figure for the average German rather than a position embodied by actual Jews.
There's a real ethical component to Death Drive that, if we don't explore, ends up manifesting itself in the opposite direction as incredible aggressive violence. Death Drive has the possibility of ethics, but also the possibility of the worst that happens when we don't take the ethical path.